I want to extend our welcome to all the viewers out there who are joining us. It's just a great pleasure for me to be able to talk to my friend and one-time colleague, Mike Neiberg, who is inaugural chair of war studies and professor of history in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the Army War College. Mike and I were actually colleagues. Mike, this is going back a ways. So back around 2006 or so in the history department at the University of Southern Mississippi. But we've stayed in touch over the years and seen each other quite a bit as we've both moved on to other things. And we've always had a set of shared interests. So Mike, it's great to be here with you today and have a conversation, I think, on a subject that is extremely timely, which is really responding to crisis. And, you know, obviously what needs to be said for our audience, and they've seen all the evidence they can of a current crisis, the coronavirus crisis, an economic downturn that's going to be a serious issue for leaders, for everyday people for a while to come. And it seems a good time to talk about two major 20th century crises at the end of two world wars and how leaders responded, and to raise the issue about what light that might throw on the present, about a kind of framework for comparison. And Mike, obviously you're one of the people to talk to about this. There are just too many of your books here to list for the audience, but I thought I would just mention You're Fighting the Great War, your history of World War I, Dance of the Furies, Europe and the Outbreak of World War I, The Blood of Free Men, the book you wrote about the liberation of Paris in 1944. But two books I think for our audience will be of great interest given our subject today, which is your concise history of the Treaty of Versailles and your book about Potsdam, at the end of World War II and the remaking of Europe. So I thought what I would just do is start with World War I, just take a chronological approach here and have a conversation with you about how leaders responded to these two major crises. And maybe if we have a little time here at the end, could even, raise some issues about how that relates to the present. So where to begin, Mike? I think maybe the place naturally to begin is pretty straightforward, is the world as it appeared to Allied leaders in 1918, 1919, the end of World War I. Some 10 million people had perished in that conflict. And as the American, French, British, Italian leaders met to talk about how to go forward, they've been faced, of course, with their own pandemic,
right,
with the great 1918 influenza. So I thought, Mike, what kind of, looking at that world, kind of looking back on it, how did these leaders respond to these crises? How did the world look to them, and how did they think about, moving beyond the World War?
So first off, thanks, Jason, and thanks to the museum. Thanks to Chrissy and Kate for all the work that we've done putting this together, and thanks to all of you for signing in. I hope you're being safe, and I hope you're using this as an opportunity. You obviously are if you're in this Zoom meeting, to use this time productively, hopefully. And for me, it's been a time to sort of reflect about the ways in which the days that you live in, the present time that you live in, changes the way you think about the past and changes the way that you think about these big questions that Jason is identifying, both how you deal with pandemic and how you deal with great power competition in the era of crisis, which is certainly what's going on in 1919. I don't think anybody was under any illusions that whatever they decided at the Paris Peace Conference was going to end great power competition. The question was, how do you make sense of the new world that you're living in? And what kinds of sets of ideas or philosophies do you want going forward? And one thing that this crisis has done for me, it's made me realize just how similar in some broad respects they were thinking 100 years ago. And what I mean by that is, this is simplifying things too much, but there are at least two major groups of thinkers. One is represented by Woodrow Wilson, who argues that the right solution is international and multilateral, that problems like pandemics, great power competition, decolonization, dealing with communism and the growth of Bolshevism, those are international problems that need international solutions. There are other folks like Georges Clemenceau, the French prime minister, who aren't opposed to negotiating with other countries, but they want to go strictly through a national model. And there are Americans like Theodore Roosevelt who are making the same argument back in the US. So in some ways, the question comes to your perspective. What do you think is causing the problem? And what do you think is the appropriate solution? And there are people who are thinking internationally 100 years ago, and there are people who are thinking nationally. So in some ways, I think those two mindsets would be very familiar to people from 100 years ago looking at our world. They would have recognized, I think, an awful lot more in our present situation than maybe we would expect.
Well, that leads me to a next question, Mike. You were talking about the issue of frameworks and different visions that were there already, you know, from the very beginning. These countries had fought together. Britain and France had been in the fight since 1914, the U.S. jumping in 3 years later. At what point do tensions between, say, Wilson and Clemenceau and Lloyd George already begin to emerge about an international versus a national framework, how to deal with Germany, the fact that Germany was defeated, but Germany, we'll get to this obviously later, this is a very different thing. Germany is not occupied in 1918, 1919. And how to deal with that. And obviously we'll come back to the question of the Bolsheviks and the like too. But in this case, there were already very early on tensions about how to respond and what kind of vision would really inform a peace. And could you say a bit about that?
Sure. You know, that very famously, when Georges Clemenceau saw Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, he very famously said God himself was content to give us just 10. And David Lloyd George, after the Paris Peace Conference, was asked to evaluate his own performance in the House of Commons. And he said, I don't think I did too bad, seeing that I had Napoleon on one side of me and Jesus Christ himself on the other. So there are tensions with kind of the way that Wilson is thinking about this. The first American president ever to go to Europe while in office. The first American president really to kind of try to take American ideals and apply them to the old world. So there's that problem that's playing in. I think a lot of it also depends on what you think fundamentally caused the war. If you're Georges Clemenceau, it is the aggression, there's something inherent in the German character. And remember that it was Clemenceau who had been the mayor of Montmartre, one of the Paris neighborhoods, during the Franco-Prussian War. He had argued for fighting on rather than giving up Alsace-Lorraine. So to his mind, the problem that there's something different about Germany that you have to deal with. To David Lloyd George's mind, it's a balance of power problem, that Germany just simply grew too quickly, too fast. To Wilson's mind, the problem is a lack of democracy and a lack of open markets, a lack of incentives for states to work together. So although they were allies during the war, they had very different definitions of what they thought they were doing there, and very different definitions that come out of that of what they think the way to solve it is. And we can talk about this for World War II as well, because I think many of the same problems are there. What do you think is the fundamental cause of the problem? And until you've answered that question, you really can't look to solutions. So to someone like Clemenceau, the American approach looks way too idealistic. It looks way too pie in the sky. Whereas to Wilson, Clemenceau's solutions just look like more of the same. So part of it comes from, I think, an understanding of how you view the past. To borrow the old phrase, the further you look back, the further you can look forward. So it's a different definition of what they see when they look backwards.
Yeah, and that also, you noted the differences about Germany and how they understood the sources of the conflict, and how, for example, Clemenceau views Wilson's idealism. That's obviously one of the things that people always bring up about a kind of Wilsonian perspective, is its idealism. Beyond Wilson, is there any, on the French and British side, is there any real sense that democracy in Germany, and the fact that the Kaiser had been forced out? I mean, Germany in 1918, 1919 has become a republic, or is in the process of becoming a republic, right? And so that, you think that might, for a Wilson, be a signal that yes, the German people are trying to step up and move past an older authoritarianism. But in the British and French side, who had been in the war much earlier, northern France, much of it is devastated, that the wariness, the suspicion would be significantly deeper about Germany, and not at all convinced that just because we have a Friedrich Ebert, now running Germany instead of Wilhelm II and Ludendorff, that there really is been, much change. So that's one of the things I wanted just to ask in, is that on the British and French side, is there much, interest at all in the fact that Germany seems to be transitioning to some kind of democratic system, whereas for Wilson, that may be some confirmation for him that his own point of view is correct?
I think you're right about both of those points. Not all Frenchmen are quite see the world in the way that Clemenceau does. There are plenty of French people, intellectuals, politicians who argue that, look, Germany's going to need time to figure out what its democracy is going to look like. It doesn't have the democratic traditions that Britain and France have. You need to open the borders up. You need to build links between the British and the French. There are Catholic movements inside France. There are youth movements, Socialist Party movements that are trying everything they can to build these bridges across the Rhine River, not to say, let's just kiss and make up, but to say, look, the fundamental problem of Germany was the Kaiser. It was Prussia. It wasn't Germany. That essentially the bad Prussians had lied to the good Germans, which also comes up at the end of World War II. So, as Americans are going through World War II, the number of Bavarians who are like, hey, it wasn't us, it was those guys. Something similar is happening in World War I as well. And there are people who are sympathetic. It's what they call the two Germanys argument, that there was this kind of, Germany of Beethoven and Goethe and medicine and higher learning that had somehow been corrupted by this Prussian autocracy. And now with the Prussian autocracy gone, Germany has a chance to move forward. So it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody in France and Britain trusts that, but it means that they're saying, look, if we're looking for a post-war strategy, it's better to leverage that and try to build that up than it is to continue the hatred and the enmity. And again, we all know this. This works better at the end of the Second World War, at least by the 1960s and 70s, until you're at a point right now where France and Germany have no border between them, which is, an expression that you can do this under different historical circumstances. So to me as an historian, every time I cross that border with nobody checking a passport and nobody, I know it's been a while now, but a shared currency, consultation on foreign policy, this is what a lot of people are envisioning in 1919 and into the 1920s, that you might eventually get to something like that. Maybe not quite as in-depth as we have it now. So it's not all, they're not all wildly optimistic or wildly too idealistic, I guess I want to say, but they are hoping that if you can build bridges between the two in some way, you increase the chance for cooperation rather than competition. And again, that to me is very similar to the debate we're having right now. What's the best way to deal with this crisis? Is it to continue to build those bridges, even between governments that don't necessarily trust each other, or governments that know they have different things that they're trying to accomplish? Or is the best way to do it to kind of wall yourself off and deal with it from the national perspective? There's no obvious answer to that question, but again, to me, it resonates with the kind of stuff that I studied at the end of the two world wars.
Well, Mike, those are very important points, and I think then lead to two kind of follow-ups on that. One is that you were just noting that we shouldn't be monolithic in the way we understand the responses of these three countries to how to build a new order after World War I. And so the first question would be is, what kinds of popular pressures do you see Britain, like Lloyd George had just had an election, right, at the end of 1918. Woodrow Wilson, they had been a congressional election, and he now has Republicans in Congress who are not terribly excited about a lot of the internationalist side of this whole peacemaking process. Clemenceau does not really have an election so much to deal with, but nonetheless, as you point out, there are popular pressures that he does have to respond to as well. I mean, and a lot of people, the sacrifice, the casualties that France undergoes, the destruction in significant parts of the country, that he has to listen to these pressures. He can't just simply ignore them. So I guess here we can often get so focused on the kind of big three and what's going on with them as they're trying to figure out a treaty that everyone can agree to, but they also have to, as quote, democracies, the Third Republic, Britain with its long tradition, the US, they all have to deal with pressures from below. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, I think the easiest way, and I said this in the Treaty of Versailles book, the easiest way to study the Treaty of Versailles is to look at those big three. But of course, looking around at our own country, there's no one American answer to the COVID crisis. There's no one British answer to the COVID crisis. These things are determined by where you live, middle class versus working class, all kinds of things are going to determine your response. So to me, it's more interesting kind of the ways in which the debates reach across national lines. So again, the big one is, do you want to solve these problems at the national, or in 1919, imperial level? So if you're British, do you want to do this by opening up the empire to international trade, which is an answer? Or do you want to do this by increasing those imperial ties? In other words, increasing tariffs, keeping Americans out of those markets, and trying the best that you can to kind of reinforce the empire and the strength of the empire. Both of those arguments are out there. The imperial argument wins at the end of World War I largely. It doesn't win at the end of World War II. Again, completely different contexts, where the Americans are able to force open the British Empire. In the United States, to me, the debate over the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations is fascinating. There's a group of senators that just say, I don't care what's in the thing, I'm not signing it. And there's another group that says, hey, look, there's ways in which we think this is unconstitutional. There's ways in which the League of Nations could draw the United States into a war, and the obligation to declare war belongs to the U.S. Senate. That's unconstitutional. You can't do that. There are ways in which this ties us down. There are also people who are making the argument, the League of Nations is one nation, one vote. Why would we as Americans accept the same level of power in an international organization that Ecuador would have? Why would we do that? On a pure power basis, it makes no sense. Which is why in World War II, the UN comes with the Security Council and the 5 vetoes. Otherwise, it's not clear that the UN would have gotten through the US Congress. So there are arguments there that are perfectly legitimate. To paint opponents of the League as just these backward-looking dinosaurs, I think is unfair. They had legitimate grievances. And again, there are things that we still talk about today, the World Health Organization. Do you want to be part of an organization in which you cede some of your sovereignty and you pay money into the organization, knowing that you're probably not getting as much out of it as a smaller state would, because you believe in the health of international organizations? If you accept that principle, then WHO membership makes perfect sense. If you don't, then you're not going to do that. And again, the same exact debate was happening 100 years ago. The French case is more complicated because of the immediacy of the German threat. So maybe we don't want to run down that rabbit hole unless you want me to. But the French situation is a little bit more complicated.
Right. And I think, you already sort of set me up for the second question, which is really the issue of democracy, and kind of coming back to that just for a second, and that you pointed out about popular pressures, and they're just a range of different views that are coming forward, and we should take these seriously, all these different perspectives about should there be a League of Nations? What kind of authority should it have? Should it be able to intervene in conflicts? Is it really only there to arbitrate ones that have broken out already? There's a lot of different perspectives in there. And I think because of the 1930s, the League is so badly remembered for people that it's even difficult to have a serious conversation about what things look like in 1918, 1919, when people are first just trying to envision it. But just on the side, Mike, of democracy, the fact is that the U.S. is fought World War I with a segregated military. American women, at least at the national level, don't get the right to vote until 1920 with the 19th Amendment. British women, it's during the 1920s that they'll get it. French women, not until the end of World War II.
So the Fourth Republic, right?
Right. And then, of course, that's the whole issue of the colonies, where the British and French had used colonial troops, and those respective countries, part of the British and French empires, are like, well, what about democracy here? That so much of this was being fought in the name of democracy and against German militarism and German autocracy. What is this really going to mean? And obviously at the Versailles, during the deliberations, these become real issues, right? About what do we do about opening things up? And you mentioned the issue of trade, but just in the sense of what kind should we grant more autonomy? Should we, what do we do about these movements that are calling for independence? And obviously those become quite violent in 1919. I mean, the Amritsar massacre in India, right, that you have in 1919, et cetera. So what should we do with that, you think, Mike, about the issue of democracy and how that rhetoric had been there very late in the war, and how the big three then have to confront that? That'll be also, just for our viewers, a kind of segue into addressing the Bolshevik revolution and the particular challenge that has. But these three countries have real issues about democratization they have to address.
They have enormous issues. And of course, there's a difference between the democracy and the polity being that group that kind of has the right to vote. The Imperial Question is an enormous one. It's an enormously complicated one. My Canadian friends are very fond of the anecdote. The first time Canada ever signs a document in its own right is the Treaty of Versailles. And the original one, the first one they signed on the wrong line. So they had to put an addendum on the original Treaty of Versailles document. So my Canadian friends love to point that one out. Just, how ambiguous this kind of leap on the world stage was for Canada. Much more negatively, you pointed out India and Amritsar. When the First World War began, Gandhi was a supporter of the war because he thought that the British Empire was doing the right thing by standing up to German aggression. By the end of the war, he's realized this isn't a war about democracy at all. This isn't a war about independence and freedom and all of the things that the Allies had talked about. Erez Manela, a supremely talented historian at Harvard, wrote a book called The Wilsonian Moment, in which he argued that people around the world, Cairo, South Korea, Vietnam, China, all over the world, read Woodrow Wilson and thought, wow, the Americans are actually going to fight for democracy. This is what they need. The 14 points can be read as anti-imperial. He's serious about this. And the point that he makes is by the middle of the Paris Peace Conference, it becomes perfectly obvious that that's not what Wilson has in mind at all. He doesn't have in mind the end of the British Empire, the end of the French Empire at all. What he really has in mind is America's right to trade in those empires. So Erez's book is really about the kind of disillusion that a lot of people around the world start to sense in American rhetoric. And of course, President Roosevelt's going to try to bring that back in the Second World War with the Atlantic Charter. He's going to try to put a lot more teeth behind it than Wilson did. So it's a really complicated, and there are a couple of parts of the world, the Shandong Peninsula controversy in China and Syria, which are two of the areas that are in Palestine, it's a third, where these kind of interests and values come in conflict with each other. Armenia is another example, and the United States simply doesn't know what to do because we're still trying to figure out what all of this means. So the end of the First World War creates a lot of these kind of legacy conflicts, Palestine, Shandong, all of these things, Vietnam, that are going to come back and bite people before the 20th century is over. And I think in a lot of ways, we talk at the Army War College sometimes about the wars we're fighting right now as the wars of the Ottoman succession, by which we mean we're still trying to figure out how you govern a complicated place like the Middle East in the absence of a centralized authority like the Ottoman Empire, semi-centralized. There's a wonderful quotation, I'll just end with this, and then we can talk about the competing anti-imperial visions between the United States and the Bolsheviks. But there's a wonderful quotation, David Lloyd George in 1917, in the middle of the Third Battle of Ypres, in the middle of Passchendaele. He's talking about British operations in Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Palestine. And he says, look, right now we're focused on Passchendaele. We're focused on Third Ypres because it's the thing where our troops are fighting. He said, but when we look down the road, it's Mesopotamia and Palestine that are going to be the things that we're going to have to deal with. And of course, those are two fundamental issues to American foreign policy, even as we sit here.
Right. Yeah, there's so much more, Mike, we could say about that. An uprising in present-day Iraq in 1920 that the British have to deal with, right? And then the issue of Palestine would be a whole other webinar.
Yes, it would.
We could talk about, right? So these are big ones. China, you mentioned the May 4th movement that starts in 1919. So this is a huge question, and I think connects directly then to the particular kind of challenge that the Bolshevik Revolution posed to the big three. And this is a subject I'm very interested in, and how once Lenin, Trotsky, and the Bolsheviks seized power in October, November, depending on your calendar, 1917, they, of course, publish all of the secret treaties that Imperial Russia had signed with Britain and France, expecting a victory and who was going to get what in terms of Ottoman territory from Austria-Hungary, etc. They were very glad to kind of show countries around the world, this is really what this war is being fought over. And Lenin really gives this kind of overriding vision to revolutionaries that the World War was not a tragedy. It was not an aberration. It wasn't that Europe went crazy. This was a necessary outgrowth of what he called imperialism. Imperialism is a worldwide system, and so there's really no desire to go back to the status quo ante, which a lot of socialists, in fact, during the war say? We should go back to what we had prior to June 28th, 1914. Let's just go back. And Lenin
what we had in January 2020, right?
Right.
just try to turn the clock back if you can.
You know, like this kind of idea, if we could just go back. And Lenin's like, no, the only way that you're actually going to move beyond the sources of the World War is revolution. And so he saw the revolution in Russia as the beginning of a worldwide revolution that would not only, you know, take place in the capitalist countries themselves, but in the colonized world. It would be, it was really global. It was a global vision. And so for the big three, and we could even bring in here Italy and say some Orlando, because there's going to be so much turmoil in Italy that would be the Mussolini kind of question coming next. But in this sense, Mike, how do you think that the 3-4 leaders of the Western Allies, how did they make sense of this, and how they thought, what should we do to respond to this?
So it's really interesting. There is a way to interpret the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris Peace Conference as the understanding among the Western powers that great power competition has now shifted, that Germany is in fact no longer your great power competitor. It is now the Soviet Union. And there is a way to understand Wilson's 14 points and even the Treaty of Versailles itself as responses to that. So the Treaty of Versailles, if you read it, I don't recommend that people do, but if you want to read it, it includes a lot about protection of labor. It includes a lot about the right of women to vote in plebiscites, even if they're not allowed to vote in the states in which they live, as you talked about a little earlier. It talks about guarantees of minimum wages. It talks about the right of people, no matter where they live in Europe, if they move from one country to another, that their wages can't be cut. It talks about all that stuff. And one way to understand that is, of course, that they're trying to undercut the Bolshevik argument. They're trying to say, don't throw the whole baby out with the bathwater. We can sustain this capitalist economic system without going down that crazy road. And then there is a way to understand the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris Peace Conference as a way to say to the imperial world, to India, to Africa, to China, to all of these places, there's a way in which you can get what you want without going down that Bolshevik road. There's a way in which we can understand this. And as you mentioned, one of the things I think that is so different in great power competition at the end of World War I from its beginning, it's a national war. It's France against Germany. By the time you get to the 20s, 30s, and I would argue into World War II, there's an ideological dimension that's playing over this, where fascists in all countries are seeing similarities, and Bolsheviks in all countries are seeing similarities. So you get this kind of multi-dimensional war that you see starting to begin intellectually in this process that you're describing. So for Wilson, for Clemenceau, for Lloyd George, what do we do about the Soviet Union? The most obvious question they ask is, should we invite them to the Paris Peace Conference? The answer to that is no. So if you're not going to do that, what do you do about them? And of course, we all know Wilson will make the decision to send American troops into Siberia. They're going to have to work hard with Japan in order to get Japan's support, which is part of the reason they give the Shandong Peninsula, which is 100% Chinese. They give it to Japan at the end of World War I, which causes tremendous disillusion inside the United States as a sellout of every principle that Wilson had, which it is. But on the other hand, it's a way to get Japanese support for this war that they think they have to fight in Russia. So the interlocking pieces and the way that, if you think about it for the engineers out there, like in a systems engineering problem, when you push on one part of the system, it's going to produce weird outcomes in another part of the system. So in order to prevent Bolshevism from taking over in Germany, you have to give a peninsula in China to the Japanese. And that's the kind of thing that they're trying to deal with in Paris.
That's a fascinating point, Mike. And also just to add to that one of the things, of course, the Bolsheviks just overtly present as an alternative is, instead of the parliamentary democracy kind of models for all their variations, British, French, American, they'll say, well, look, those models are directly tied to this war. They're really kind of mask for bourgeois class power. And they present the Soviets, these councils that had emerged in 1917, workers, radicalized soldiers, sailors, peasants. This is a model of workers' democracy that they want to present. Obviously, this is before this turns into a one-party state. I mean, the Bolsheviks are even governing with another party for several months in 1917, 1918. So the challenge is directly there. And that's an interesting way of thinking about it, is Wilson is really crafting a response that he hopes will sap some of the energy and the discontent and the anger coming out of the war that the Bolsheviks are directly trying to appeal to. Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, Bulgaria, the Baltic states, all over. They're really trying to mobilize that. But they're not the only ones, obviously, Mike, that are trying to mobilize discontent. When we get into 1919, we also have a brand new player politically on the scene, and that's Benito Mussolini's fascist movement, which in the space then of remarkably 3 years, then they're actually in power. 1919 is the same year we have the first kind of version of what will become the Nazi Party in Bavaria that Hitler will get involved in right away. And I know there's a lot to pack in here, but and from the way you look at this history, how do we relate the beginnings of fascism to the Versailles process and this rebuilding movement? How did Mussolini and Hitler, not only there's the anger about the territorial kind of remapping, that's always brought up, but there's a larger challenge that Mussolini and Hitler posed to this system.
Yeah, so I once did this at Southern Miss so well that a student complained to the dean and my department head that I was trying to turn them into fascists. So that's not what I'm trying to do here. The original intellectual model of fascism made the argument that Marxism and communism could not be right. Because if class conflict was truly the engine of world change, as Marx argued, then the workers of France would not have killed the workers of Germany, and the workers of Germany wouldn't have killed the workers of Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So in effect, Marx had to be wrong. So what Mussolini and the intellectuals around him, more the intellectuals than Mussolini himself, concluded is that it must be the nation state, and it must be some irrationality in people's identification with the nation state that drove them forward. Now, as you pointed out, what that does is it taps into this febrile environment of all of these land claims and everybody that's disaffected by the war and the way that the war ends. And I also think you get this kind of almost mirror identification, so that fascism becomes identified by the ways in which it is not Bolshevik, and Bolshevists become identified by the ways in which they're not fascist. So that you get this, polarization in these societies. It occurs all across Europe. It occurs in France, of course. There's a civil war in Spain that's partly informed by this, not totally, but partly, so that the center really comes under a lot of pressure. So the way that I try to describe it to students is that both of these systems are real challenges to the kind of democratic capitalist system that, at least in the Anglo-American world and the British Empire world, they're trying to hold on to. They're trying to hold that center ground. And the Second World War is very much the story of how that doesn't happen. And two of those systems end up fighting the third, so that the Anglo-American capitalist system and the Bolshevik system end up as temporary allies. And then, of course, you can see the Cold War as the final kind of, at least in some versions of history, the final competition of the end of the First World War, when the Bolshevik system is finally defeated itself, at least the Soviet model of it. So you can take the very broad picture of the First World War and argue that that's what this is. It's a competition of ideologies as you're moving forward. It's also, I think, instructive to think about the ways in which, fascism as an ideology is more nationalistic than Bolshevism is, so that it's actually difficult in some cases for fascists to think across national borders. For Bolsheviks, it's easy. The ideology is by definition international.
Workers of all lands unite, right?
Workers of all lands unite. So you end up with a very different kind of way of thinking about the world. So that's about as quick as I can do it. Like I said, I did this for 15 minutes once, depicting these two ideologies in class, and I actually got reported to the dean's office. So I don't want to make the case, but but there is a way in which you have to explain why people in Europe are so disaffected by the world that they see, that they're moving to these two extremes rather than reinforcing the center. And of course, the Great Depression only fuels that further.
Right. Well, you've already, raised the Second World War, Mike, and just watching our time here, I think we should transfer over. So we have, I think, a very good basis now for thinking about the Versailles Moment, the end of the First World War, and how that we can really compare that then looking at the world in 1945. And you've already pointed out that there is this, I think Walter Lefebvre used the term a shotgun marriage between the kind of Anglo-American liberal democratic capitalist states and the Soviet Union, of course, under Joseph Stalin, and that they have to come together and cooperate to defeat Mussolini, Hitler, Imperial Japan. How does the world look, if we're going to now work out this framework of comparison at Potsdam? And now what's the kind of choices that they're kind of faced with making then? And instead of having it's Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and Wilson, you have Churchill, Harry Truman. Churchill's actually going to leave in the middle of the Potsdam hearings. And then you're going to, and Joseph Stalin, like it's a different big three. And in fact, it's really two when we come down to it about in the terms of the emerging superpowers. So how do we make sense then, Mike, of that 1945 perspective?
So here's what I think is going on. I argued in the Potsdam book that every single issue except what to do with the atomic bomb that they discussed at Potsdam, they also discussed at Versailles, at the Paris Peace Conference. What do you think caused these wars? What do you want to do with Germany? How do you rebuild the economies? What do you do with the empires? They're all familiar questions. For the Americans, at least, the answer is we're going to hold to the Wilsonian principles of internationalism, but we're not going to rely on faith and love and the trust of man to do this. We're going to come in with serious instruments of power behind us. And the way that I describe this is Truman was a poker player. He didn't want to go to Potsdam until he had chips in his pocket. So before he left for Potsdam, he knew that the Senate had approved American membership in the UN, the Bretton Woods Agreement, the International Monetary Fund, all those instruments of power that the US would have economically. And of course he knew, once he got to Potsdam, that the atomic bomb had succeeded. So we're going to take the same principles that we took. Truman took the oath of office for president under a portrait of Woodrow Wilson, but we're not doing this by persuasion anymore of the Wilsonian rhetoric. This time we're going to say, look, if you don't want to play the game our way, here's the ways in which we can hurt you. So the atomic bomb is obviously the most extreme version of that, but even the loan terms to the British Empire at the end of the war are things that you can use. So part of Lend-Lease is, hey, we're going to get to trade inside your empire. Those days of the imperial preference system, they're done. So the way I think about Potsdam, it is the Americans coming in with very similar ideals, but very different ways that they want to achieve it. The fundamental questions that still remain, though, what do you think caused this war? If you think it's Germany, that there's something wrong with the German people, then you're going to argue for an occupation. You're going to argue for something like what Henry Morgenthau, the American Treasury Secretary, argued, which was to break Germany up basically to its 1648 borders, remove it from having a central government. If you think that it's a balance of power issue, then you're going to actually want to put resources into Germany so that the Germans can then balance the Soviet Union, which now looks like it's an emerging threat, if not an enemy quite yet. So to me, and they know it. These guys know it, right? I mean, they all remember Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles is not something that happened hundreds of years ago to them. They know it, right? So they come in and they say, look, we've got another bite at this apple. If we do as badly as they did 25 years ago, we're just going to screw it up and create a third world war. So the American decision is there's going to be no single treaty that comes out of it because they don't want to do what Wilson had to do. There's going to be no set reparations so that we can adjust whatever we have to do economically as we go. And we're just going to have three parties represented there. The whole world's not going to come. There's going to be three parties there. France doesn't come. Poland doesn't come. Just three countries. That's it. So it is done very, very differently than the way they do it at Versailles, with, I think, a very, very different outcome. Obviously, we know now it's a more positive outcome, though I think we sometimes underestimate how chaotic the world was in 1945 and how lucky Europe actually got at the end of the war.
That makes me think about, we're just talking about there's really three that are just there. And we could easily just simply focus on Truman and Stalin, and of course are hugely important. But Mike, obviously in the British case, if we think about Lloyd George had just been faced with an election in 1918 when he was at Versailles and what was expected of him or what he thought was expected of him. In the British case, they have an election in the summer of 1945 where Churchill's out and Labour is in, Clement Attlee is in. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact Britain had been a world power for so long and is now being faced with a situation where it really is number three at best, and a kind of distant third, given where the Americans and Soviets were at. What should we do with this, with the British? What kind of changes or what was going on there in the way Britain understood itself at Potsdam from Churchill to Attlee, and understanding this is a very different landscape than we faced 25 years earlier?
So I think the British are going through that same question. What do you want to do? Do you want to reinforce the empire, be able to draw resources out of that empire at the end of the war? Or do you really need to think about radical changes to the way that you're going to organize society? John Maynard Keynes, who was the British economic advisor, both at the Paris Peace Conference and at Potsdam, was perfectly well aware. He argued as often as he could, we cannot go back to the way that we had things before. It's just not going to work. We're going to have to be subservient to the Americans, whether we want to or not. Our future political and economic success will be tied to the Americans, whether we want it to or not. And the empire is going to be a money loser because it's going to be too hard to go back in there and do things the way that we had done it before. So he's a voice that's arguing for just a complete change of thought on the way that Britain thinks about everything that it organizes. As with many visionaries, a lot of people don't like listening to him because they think that it's just too radical a change. One Bank of England executive said the only thing worse than losing the war is winning it with the Americans by our side, meaning that the America's price for victory is too high. So I think a lot of this kind of rhetoric of special relationship is built to mask an awful lot of that, an awful lot of the way that Americans understood we're not going back to what we had. We are now clearly going to be top dog, and we're gonna set things the way that we want to set them, which is what the United States did. It's the post-war world for the United States. For Britain, it really is an awareness that you're going to come out of this war, much the way the French came out of the First World War, victorious but very weak. And you're going to need time to build back up, and you're going to have to face some very, very difficult questions going forward, especially given that the British want to put in national health insurance and all these kind of social rewards. A good friend of mine, Jonathan Fennell, has just written a book basically arguing that this is what British soldiers believed they were fighting for in 1944-45. Yes, the defeat of Germany, but we're fighting to create a Britain that will provide the working classes with some of the rewards that citizens of a great country should have. Well, those things are expensive, and they're difficult to deal with. There's a wonderful, one of the British Air Force museums has one of the first British nuclear missiles there. And there's a sign on it from Bevan, the foreign minister at Potsdam, in which he says Britain is going to have an independent nuclear force, and that missile is going to have a great big bloody Union Jack on it. In other words, we're still going to be here, and we're going to be independent. Other people like Alan Brooke realized, no, you may have those things, but the Americans will never let you use them independently.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think good for everyone to remember about the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union are the real power brokers in this immediate post-war world. But in this case, Mike, we have Harry Truman, who's only been in office 3 months, really, after FDR's death. And of course, we have the changeover from Churchill. He had been such a presence to Attlee. But the big change, of course, is the Soviets are there. Yeah. They had not been in 1919. So much, in fact, had been about, as we noted, had been about positioning the Western world against the spread of the Bolshevik Revolution. But here Stalin is there. And how do the Americans and British deal with that? We have Joseph Stalin. We have the Red Army had played such a decisive role in defeating Hitler. What do we do with that? How do we have them at the table while at the same time not, letting them have their way? How did the Americans and British respond?
So that's the great power competition question of 1945. How do you read the Russians? So there are folks like George Kennan who argue the Soviets came out of this war victorious, but they're not going to be celebrating in Times Square like we did. They're going to come out of the war even more paranoid than when they went in it. And whatever strength you push them with, they're going to push back twice as hard. So if you try to take Poland or you try to move up closer to their border, they're going to push back at you. So the question really becomes, there's three, very quickly, there are three at least different ways of looking at the Russians. The first is Kennan's, which argues that it doesn't matter what ideology their government is. What they basically want is what the Tsar wanted in 1914. They want control of Poland, warm water ports, border security. There is a much more aggressive voice in Washington that says, no, this is an ideological problem. This is a global, worldwide Bolshevik communist problem that we're going to end up dealing with all over the world. Better to deal with these guys now than let that grow. And there is a third argument, eventually it becomes Kennan's containment argument that says, look, you can't stop them from expanding. What you can do is keep them, you can't stop them from being a world power. What you can do is stop them from expanding until the internal contradictions of their own system make it collapse from inside. And that's, of course, the way that this eventually works, though it takes, almost 50 years to make it happen. But Kennan's core argument in the containment theory is that it's a system that's basically a house of cards. If you push against it, they have enough military strength to push you back. They've shown that over the past 150 years. But the best way to do it is to just let them kind of stew in their own juices until the economy, society, politics of this corrupt system just comes apart. So again, it's a question of how you think the Soviets got there, and what you think they're up to conditions the American response. At Potsdam, most people go into that conference still believing that the United States and Soviet Union can have a constructive relationship in the post-war period. There's a photograph I love to show when I talk about Potsdam. It's Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, and the new American Secretary of State, James Burns. They are arm in arm and smiling, right? The notion here is we've beaten the Germans. We're not yet enemies, right? That'll happen after Potsdam, right? That'll start to develop after the conference. But it's not the zeitgeist. It's not the mood at the conference itself.
Yes, and just worth pointing out as we're wrapping up, Mike, and about to take questions too. And I think the Western Allies, whether they were aware of it or not, in many cases didn't want to see it. It's interesting that Stalin shared much of their suspicion about revolution, that he was himself very wary about kind of workers and peasants movements emerging out of the resistance against the fascist powers, against Imperial Japan. If you're thinking about China, Southeast Asia, he's very wary of them too. I mean, he really wants to keep a tight lid on movements in his own sphere of influence too. So it's interesting that one of the things they share, even though it's not something they share overtly, is a real wariness about anything too radical coming from below.
This is the argument for seeing Stalin as just basically another czar, right? What he wants geopolitically is the same thing that the Romanovs wanted. So don't read too much ideology into him. What he really is a dictator trying to control the borders of his own country, just as any dictator would. So again, the key point is in 1945, we're just not sure what to do with the Soviets.
Right. No, that's great. So Mike, I want to first just thank you for a great conversation. I mean, we covered a lot of ground in 45 or so minutes,
we did.
but we obviously should open things up and see what kinds of questions our viewers had. I know we already had one here, so I'm just going to jump in, Mike, and take us through at least a few of these. We've got from Dan in Michigan. He wanted to know, can you help me understand why the U.S. allowed Berlin to be divided?
So if you're a University of Michigan fan, I will. That's where I went. If you're Michigan State, we're going on to the next question. The argument is that Eisenhower called Berlin a prestige objective. In other words, there's nothing militarily necessary about the occupation of Berlin because the Yalta Agreement had said that there was going to be a kind of shared occupation of Germany. So Eisenhower's argument is, look, we still have a war with the Japanese we have to deal with. I'm not going to let my soldiers get killed for something that we have to give back to the Soviets anyway. So the argument was physically, the occupation of it, the taking of it is the responsibility of the Soviet Union. But the post-war political arrangement is going to be that there's going to be some level of sharing, some level of cooperation in the occupation of Germany. So to Eisenhower's mind, it makes no sense to see American soldiers get killed for something you're just going to have to hand back. I think that's a perfectly defensible point from the perspective of 1944, 1945, especially given, as I said, Eisenhower's assumption that so many of those troops are going to have to be rotated back to Asia. So that's the basic thinking.
Good, thank you. Yeah, that leads to the next point, which you mentioned about the atomic bomb as its own thing, right? I mean, it's a fundamentally new development in world history. Truman announces it to Stalin there. Where do we fit the atom bomb into this, idea about we need a new world order? We shouldn't repeat the mistakes of 1918, 1919. Yet there's this hugely complicating factor, which is the splitting of the atom and the weaponization of that. And how does that fit in the way we think about the resolution of the World War II crisis, Mike?
One of my favorite anecdotes that comes out of Potsdam, as soon as the reports come in that the Trinity Test has succeeded, they're in Potsdam when this happens. Churchill gives a speech to the British delegate, or talks to the British delegation, basically saying this is the end of all our problems, right? This is a cheap way to keep military power. Anytime the Soviets try to push us around, we can just do this. We can knock out this city. We can destroy this city. And Alan Brooke, the British chief of staff, just writes in his diary something like, I had to calm Winston down and he didn't like it. Right? I had to explain to him that this is not like other weapons. Right? Alan Brooke understood in July 1945, the only way, once World War II is over, the only way you can use nuclear weapons is for deterrence. That's it. That's it. It's a weapon you're going to invest a lot of money in and never use. So he saw that right away. So again, there's another question of what do you actually do with these weapons once you develop them? Now, we have followed the Alan Brooke method, or Alan Brooke's strategy, though there are other things we could have done. But that's another kind of dark cloud hanging over it. And I also cite in the Potsdam book, and I like to recite these for my students here at the War College, most senior leaders other than Churchill, virtually all of them, were incredibly depressed that the Trinity Test had worked. Because what it meant was either war was going to be separated from its strategic dimension and just be about raw killing, or it meant that you were going to end up with whatever war you fought, killing hundreds of millions of people, potentially every time you went about and did any military action at all. So they are very dark, they're very morose, they're very upset about it. And I love to point that out to people. This is not a moment of triumph in their eyes. This is a moment of something that we may have to do, and it's certainly better that we did it before the Soviets or the Germans did it, but this is a giant step backward in the way that people are thinking about military strategy.
Mike, in fact, you just noted about the Soviet Union being in. This is a different thing, and then how does that affect the whole framework of negotiations? France is out as opposed to 1919. And we have a viewer who wanted to know about Charles de Gaulle. You noted that, that they have the big three are there, and they're going to decide, really, the Americans and Soviets, and other countries are going to have to just accept that fact. In the case of de Gaulle, how does he respond to this new order that's being proposed at Potsdam?
He ain't happy. De Gaulle is technically the leader of the provisional government of the Republic of France. He is not the head of a government. So he is excluded on those grounds. He's also excluded because Truman and Churchill had both just had enough of him. Truman makes a comment to James Burns's assistant, which I happened to just come across almost by accident in the Clemson Library when I was looking through Burns's papers, where he says, if I want to talk to de Gaulle, I will send for him as I would the head of any other small power. Right? So the notion is that they're not really sure what they want to do with France yet. Right? Do we treat France as a liberated country like we're going to treat Holland? Or do we treat it as an occupied country the way we might treat Italy? So how are we going to do this? The first time the Americans go into combat in Europe, of course, is against French troops. It's against Vichy. So what do we want to do? De Gaulle, that's not de Gaulle. De Gaulle's a very different kind of France and represents a different kind of France. But the United States has I think they more or less have determined by this point that they don't have a choice, that de Gaulle is going to be the leader of France when this is all over. But that doesn't mean they have to give him the elevated status of letting him sit around a table with two elected officials, right, Truman and Churchill, and then with the leader of the Soviet Union. That de Gaulle's just not at that level yet. De Gaulle is furious, and Churchill snubs him. Churchill, before Potsdam, went down to Hendaye, which is a resort town near the Spanish border inside France. Neither on the way down there nor on the way back did Churchill go to Paris to meet with de Gaulle. So there were intentional snubs aimed at him, and de Gaulle will get his revenge, but it'll be a few years in the making.
He's thinking about it the whole time, though, right? I mean, about...
Oh, no doubt.
Right? He's really thinking about it. So, Mike, we're almost out of time, and I just want to close with one question that's been posed here. It's not exactly a small one, but maybe just you can say briefly about it, is there any unity at all among the leaders of the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union about the colonial issue at Potsdam? Is there anything that they can come together on with respect to, okay, here we are, another world war has been fought. The colonized world was certainly played a huge role in that. Is there anything that they can agree on about what to do about that coming out of Potsdam?
Maybe my brain's been a little bit conditioned by the de Gaulle question, but the one thing they do agree on is that the French Empire in Asia is done. That is Indochina. That's done. It's not going to go back to France. There's some backpedaling on that a little bit after the war. But the general sense is that The general sense, I think, is that the United Nations is going to be the instrument to handle this. I think there was an expectation on the Soviet side, and I don't read Russian, I'm not a Soviet specialist, that the empire just, there's no way the British and French could walk back into those places and exercise authority. There's just no way. And I think there was some expectation on the American side that something similar would happen. The British, they're, even Attlee, who is a labor leader and fairly far to the left, wanted India to stay inside the British Empire. So the major big issues about what to do are perfectly wide open. And of course, the issue of Palestine is one that will become a major sticking point between the British and the Americans in the late 1940s. So I don't think there's much agreement except that the states that aren't represented are the ones whose empires might go away.
Well, Mike, yeah, there's so much to say about that question and all the other ones we've covered today, but let me thank you very much for a great discussion. I hope our viewers really gotten something out of it. And obviously, please consult if you want more on Mike's 2 books about the concise history of the Treaty of Versailles and his book on Potsdam and the remaking of Europe. But let me thank all of you for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure for me. It's great to see you as always, Mike.
Thank you. Be safe, everybody. Thanks.